Hi, my name is Nick from Accounting Add-ons, and in this video I'll showcase how to use Power Query functions to improve the performance when pulling data from MYOB. Now MYOB's API is pretty robust, but if you have a particularly large MYOB file and you're trying to pull a large amount of data all at once, it might actually be too much for the MYOB API to handle. So what you then need to do is actually break down that process into more manageable chunks, say downloading a single month at a time, multiple times. And Power Query functions allow you to do just that. So let's get into it. So I'll jump to OdataLink and I'll copy the OData URL, and then I'll go to Power BI, get data from OData feed, and I'll paste that in. Now for this example, I'll use two different endpoints. I'll use the dates by months endpoint, which essentially gives me a table of date ranges for specific months. And I'll want to pull journal transactions because that's a very large endpoint that notoriously can have issues on very large data files, especially if you need a lot of information. I'll then click transform. The first thing I'll do is actually filter my data to have less information, but I'm also doing that so that I'll be able to actually use that filter and control it later on when I create my function. So I'll go to the date occurred field and filter between two dates, and I'll use the 1st of July 2021 to the 31st of July 2021. Now the dates here don't really matter because again I'll replace it with a parameter later on. I'll click OK, and now I can see my data. I'll scroll across and I'll expand different fields that I might be interested in using. And before we create our function, we'll need to define the parameters that that function will use. So we'll go Manage Parameters, New Parameter, and we'll add a new parameter called Start Date of type date, and we'll put a dummy value in there. And we'll add a new parameter called End Date of type date with a dummy value as well. And we can click OK. You can actually see the two parameters have been defined. Before we create the function, we'll now need to apply the parameters to the journal transactions endpoint. So we'll select it and we'll go back to the filtered row step. And you can see in the formula bar, you can see the hard-coded dates were there. Now we could actually overtype that with the name of our parameters, start date and end date, or alternatively we can go to the gear icon and use this drop down to choose a parameter and make sure that the first one is the start date and the second one is the end date. If we click OK, you can see it's done the equivalent, it's overtyped those values. The final step to create our function is to right-click on our journal transactions endpoint and choose Create Function. We can give it a name, Get Journal Data, and we can click OK. And you can actually see it's added a folder called Get Journal Data, inside which there's our journal transactions, the two parameters, and our function. You can actually see the function has the two parameters, a start date and end date. If we want to test it out, we could type in different dates, and if we click Invoke, it'll actually call the function and invoke it with that date range. Now we don't need the test anymore, so we can delete it out. So now that we know that the function is working, we can apply it. And to do that, we can go back to our dates by months endpoint that has the first date and last date columns formatted correctly. And what we'll do is we'll go to Add Columns, Invoke Custom Function. We'll call the column Data, but you can choose any name you want, and we'll call the Get Journals Data function. The start date will be set to the first date, and the end date will be set to the last date. If we click OK, what this will do is for each of our date combinations here, it will actually call the function and add a table record. We can then expand that table, click OK, and this will actually show the actual transaction data for each of these records. You can actually see for some date range there was no journals, which is why they're appearing as null, while for others there's actually multiple journals downloaded. For instance, in April there's a series of them, and if we scroll down you can actually see all the data was downloaded. Now the final step I'd recommend you do is double check the actual data type of each column. Whenever you call a function, usually what happens is it'll revert the type back to general ABC123. So you'll want to make sure that your dates are set to dates. And that the amount is set to decimal. Before we return to Power BI, we'll rename our dates by months endpoint to be results. And we'll also right-click on the journal transactions and untick enable load, because we don't actually want the journal transactions to be loaded into Power BI because we're using it through our get journal data function. Once we've done that, we can go to home, close and apply, and load the data. And the last step to prove that everything's working, we'll add a simple table to Power BI, and we'll include the date occurred, the description, the account name, and the amount. We'll ungroup the date occurred, and we'll sort by it. And you can actually see it's pulled data for April, October, all the way to July 2021. Now our sample MYOB file doesn't have a lot of information, but this highlights that the concept actually works. Now this concept should actually only be used if you've got performance headaches. If your data file is very small, you don't need to go through this extra step, and in fact going through this extra step might actually slow down the get data process. But if you've got a very large MYOB file and it performs badly, this approach will actually make it work. I hope you found it interesting, and I'll catch you next time. Bye.